Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my video review of the new TTArtisan 100mm F2.8. This is a 2x macro, and it's a tilt shift lens. This is easily the most complex lens that I've seen from one of these smaller third-party lens makers, and they have really tackled a lot of things here. First of all, this is the longest focal length I've ever seen from TTArtisan. On top of that, it's not just a 1x macro or a 1-to-1 macro, which I have seen them do before, but this is a 2x macro, which takes a whole nother level of engineering. It is also the first tilt or shift lens, or in this case, both tilt and shift, that I've seen them tackle, and something that very few manufacturers actually do, because there is a lot of engineering complexity involved here. So kudos to them, and they've not done it for APS-C or micro four thirds. They've done it for full frame here. Though I will note that while I'm reviewing on a full frame Sony E mount, it's also available in Canon RF, Nikon Z or Z mount, and Leica L, but you can also get it in some smaller sensor mounts like Fuji X and micro four thirds. But this is, I don't want to undersell it. This is designed for full frame, and as we're going to see, it is effectively covers the full frame image circle and does a great job in doing it. There's a lot of moving parts in a lens like this, and so a lot of complexity that's been introduced, and so for a lens that has that degree of magnification, then also adding both the tilt and the shift capability means that this is a lens that can move in all kinds of directions, up and down, side to side. It can rotate around. There's a lot going on here, and then of course the ability to have that extremely high level of magnification. This is a lot of lens for the money, which, by the way, the money comes in at right around $400 US. So we're going to break down all of the various aspects of performance here today in this review, right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So as you can see here, this is not a small lens. In fact, it would be pretty much impossible to make a full frame lens that does all that this lens does and to make it a small lens. And so I weighed it in at 841 grams. That's right around 29 ounces. I measured it as being 73 millimeters in diameter. Now I will note that that is the barrel itself. There are protrusions coming off here as far as the knobs. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But in each one of the cardinal positions, there is some kind of knob, either the locking knob or a adjustment knob for either tilt or shift functionality. So on every side, you do have something that is protruding. And that does, of course, bear into the diameter, though the lens barrel diameter I measured in at 73 millimeters or 2.87 inches. It's quite a long lens at 147 millimeters or 5.78 inches. I will note, however, it is an internally focusing lens, and so the lens does not grow in length. You can see a pretty significant movement front and back inside the lens casing itself, and so the focus elements are moving back and forth, but it's all within the confines of the lens. So while this is not a weather sealed lens, typically those lenses like this, that everything that happens inside the lens itself, it's all encased, does make it a little bit more effective at resisting things like dust or moisture intrusion. Now, my chief complaint when it comes to the physical design here actually comes down to the ergonomics. One of the things that I'm going to highlight is TTArtisan's fault. The other is kind of more on Sony. So on a lens like this that, as noted, it has a protrusion. No matter how you rotate the lens, there is something that is protruding off the lens barrel. And one thing that I have long noted about Sony bodies is that because the Sony E mount is such a narrow mount, it means that Sony doesn't have to leave a ton of room between the mount and the grip. And in fact, I don't think that they leave enough room. And so it's not unusual for a lens to flare out, and if you have decent sized hands, to feel a little bit of pressure against your knuckles between a lens and the actual grip of the camera itself. Now in this case, because we have something that protrudes no matter how you rotate the lens, it means that there's almost always going to be something that's rubbing against your knuckles a little bit if you're using this lens handheld. And that's because there's always something to protrude out. Now, if you're using it on a Canon RF or Nikon Z mount, something like that, you may have less of an issue because the mounts are larger for those camera systems, and as a byproduct, they tend to create a little bit more space between the mount flange and then the actual grip, and so Sony has a kind of a unique problem on that front. The other ergonomic issue that I will point out is all on TTArtisan. And that is that while all of the adjustment knobs are metal, or which I appreciate, it is not unusual. For example, there is one down here that is it's just more of like a little tension knob, and it's so not a full-size knob, but it's more almost like a lever in its shape. But what I find for that is that, number one, it can be really, really hard to access if you're on a tripod, for example, and in certain positions, just hard to get at in general. And then also, it is really hard with either of the tension knobs to dial in enough tension to where you can do what you want to do in terms of adjustment, having some tension on there, but without it, just as you can see there, just is it immediately dropping to the full position. And so it is very hard to put enough tension on here to where you can actually control it with the knob and it holds. I've got it right now, but you have to be really careful in that process because it's almost a complete lock. And so it's just right before the complete locking itself to give you enough tension, and then it's almost too much tension. But if you try to loosen it up at all, immediately it's just a complete, drop right down. So I find that it's really easy to shoot in the extreme position, so long as your extreme position happens to be you want to be pointed all the way in the direction that gravity is going. Not so easy if you want to make fine tuning. And so I think that there could be a little bit more work on the damping process in the lens design that allows you a little bit more control when it comes to that tension. And so that's probably my least favorite aspect of the overall physical design. This is a lens that you're almost exclusively going to use off of a tripod, or at least most of the situations. It is very difficult to do any kind of tilt or shift type work handheld, and 2x macro, even if you've got a camera, as I do here, that has in-body image stabilization, you're not going to really have a lot of opportunity for doing handheld macro at a 2x kind of distance. It's too much potential for shakiness. And so this is a lens you're going to probably want to use on a tripod. And again, those ergonomics make it sometimes harder than what it should be to use in that kind of position. A few other things I want to highlight here is that we do have an aperture ring on here. It is clicked. It's half stop to tenths through f11, and then just full stops from f11 to f16 to f22, being the minimum aperture there. The focus ring itself moves fairly well. We have got not a huge amount of focus throw for going to 2x magnification level. I estimate it as being somewhere about 170 degrees of rotation here. It moves fairly well. The damping is fairly good. I did feel in some cases where I'm going a little bit faster, just not quite slippage, but just a little bit of that feel. But overall, it's the damping, I would say, is about right for here, to where it is moderately heavy, to where you can hold the position you want, but it's smooth to where you can make fine tuning and get the results that you want there. So that is done pretty well. Up front, we do not have a lens hood here, and that becomes relevant in our image quality discussion in just a moment. What we do have is a cap that goes over the outer barrel, and so obviously you couldn't have a lens hood and put this kind of cap system on. We have a 6-7mm front filter thread, and by the way, the suction and the fit there is good and tight. This is not going to fall off accidentally. Zero issues with that. But while you could thread on, an aftermarket 67mm lens hood, it's going to just be ergonomically difficult. You couldn't use the lens cap. You're not going to be able to reverse it. Just a variety of factors in that. Probably most of you will end up using the lens with just the bare lens, and it is a bit flare prone, so that's going to be the downside of that. The minimum focus distance here is 25 centimeters, which I felt was not too bad considering you're going all the way to a 2 times magnification. Even though the lens is quite long, past the lens barrel, it still is giving you 9 or 10 centimeters of working distance. And if you're going to 1-to-1 level, it's more like 13 or 14 centimeters of working distance. So not terrible for that type of thing. Now, when it comes to the tilting and the shifting capabilities, we have 6 millimeters of shift in either direction. Now, that's not as much as what you're going to see on some wide-angle lenses or really a lot of dedicated tilt-shift lenses. However, it is enough to make things interesting. For example, I could take these 3 panoramic-type shots and I could combine them into one macro panorama that I think is a very cool image. I used it when, for trying to get the straight lines. Obviously, a little bit less relevant for that in interior spaces because a wide-angle lens is going to be more useful for that. But I did take a couple of shots here in a vertical orientation and I stacked them together. There's no cropping here. This is the image just as it comes out of the conjoining. You can see that the lines are really, really beautiful. And so anyway, it's an interesting lens there. And then of course it also has tilt capability. And we have 8 degrees of tilt in either direction. And so that can be used for miniature effect. And that tends to work better when you're up high. So I didn't have a lot of opportunities to test that. However, I did play with it in terms of the depth of field and the bokeh. And so, for example, in this shot of the Christmas present, you can see with no tilting effect how the background is fairly obvious. And then if I use the tilt effect, how that I can make the background, very much more blurry. And so it gives you some creative options for portraiture and things like that. And so we also have 12 internal aperture blades, keeps a nice circular shape. As you can see here, as you stop down, the geometry is quite good there. We have an optical design of 14 elements in 10 groups. And so let's break down those optics together. You can see from the MTF chart that our center and mid-frame performance is pretty good, but that the corners are quite a bit weaker, and that was borne out in my own test. So let's dive in and let's take a look at that.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. Typically, macro lenses have low levels of distortion because they need to have a nice flat plane of focus, and really that's the case here. There is next to no distortion there, a very, very mild amount of pincushion distortion, and a little bit of vignette, also pretty moderate. I made those manual corrections with just a -2 to correct for the bit of pincushion distortion and a +36 right over a full stop in the corners, so really not bad at all on either front. Also important in a macro lens is good control of chromatic aberrations, particularly longitudinal style chromatic aberrations that show up as fringing either before or after the plane of focus. In this case, we can see a very mild amount of purple fringing here before the plane of focus, and then also a little bit of green fringing after the plane of focus. But by and large, you can see here that it's controlled quite well. And as we look towards the kind of bokeh, here we can see that it is fairly neutral and not a significant problem there. We also have a good control of lateral chromatic aberration. So here in this landscape image, we can see detail is nice, but as we look towards the edge of the frame, we can see that there is really no fringing showing up here. We've got good contrast and detail towards the edges of the frame. The most minor amount of fringing maybe along those branches, but it's so faint that I really can't tell for sure, even if it's there. So we have a 50 megapixel sensor that we're going to do the chart test on, and this is going to be at 200% magnification shown here. In the center of the frame, we can see that detail is very good. Contrast, not necessarily off the charts, but quite good here in the center of the frame. As we move towards the mid-frame, a similar story in that we have very good detail here, and contrast is good but not exceptional. Now, as we work our way down, we can see that we're starting to see a little bit of drop from this corner to this corner of the bill, and then even here we can see that as we work towards the edge, the contrast is diminishing, though detail is not bad right over to the edge of the frame. Stopping down to F4 gives us a boost in contrast, but not necessarily a boost in detail here in the corner. Stepping on down to F5.6, we can see that we're starting to get a little bit better contrast and detail. However, It's not until f8 where I feel like the results are really starting to get sharp here as far as contrast, and even then it in no way compares to how excellent things look in the center of the frame or in the mid frame, where everything is very, very strong. Detail there looks really fantastic at either 5.6 or f8. We can see a little bit of improvement here from f5.6 to f8. Looking up in this upper corner, we can see that f8 is the most consistent across the frame in terms of our absolute detail. Now, our minimum aperture is f22, shown here on the right, but as per usual, you can see that diffraction takes quite a hit on a high-resolution body, and so it really softens up contrast even further. And so as a byproduct, we definitely, I would recommend staying away from f22 where at all possible, because I think you're going to find better results at f11 and larger. So as noted, contrast is not off the charts, and so I was shooting with the new Sigma 50mm f1.4 at the same time. The Sigma definitely has more bite. You can actually see here that detail is quite good on my subject, and the byproduct of having a little bit less contrast is that you can see that the background is really, really soft and creamy, even where we have a fairly busy background with just, these dead branches, and so, or bare branches, I should say. And so as a byproduct, I think that there is some trade-off here, and so we can see detail is good on the subject, but then the transition towards defocus is really quite nice. Now, if we take a look at the bokeh geometry, so first of all, you can see obviously this is a lens that can produce a lot of defocus because it can focus all the way down to a 2:1 level. So as a byproduct, you can see big, soft bokeh circles. You can see there is some geometric deformation towards the edges of the frame. We can see stopping down to f4, geometry is looking really actually quite good all across the frame. And I will also point out, by the way, that as we zoom in here, there is some definite inner line, but beyond that, the bokeh is fairly smooth. Stopping on down to f5.6, we can see it's still maintaining a pretty circular shape. There's 12 aperture blades, and so byproduct of that is that keeping a good circular shape, we can see that that inner line is becoming a little bit more definite as things are stopped down. But as far as the geometry goes, really not too bad. So what we have seen is that in good situations, you have the ability to really produce a nice creamy background, very nice bokeh. And so we can see here that on our subject, again, detail is great. Contrast is not off the charts, but the bokeh quality is really nice and soft. Here's a little bit further away, but you can see that even in the foreground bokeh, it's a nice perspective and a nice amount of detail there. So those two things combined together, a little less contrast and nice bokeh, does make this an intriguing option for portrait work. In this case, we've got a little bit of motion blur, as you can see. My shutter speed dropped a little bit too low for this setting, but you can see that the background is blurred out nicely. And in this shot, where I have played with the tone curve a little bit, we can see the detail is really nice on the eye that is the primary source of focus there. And then, of course, nice detail in the hair, but it's overall the background blur that is quite nice. So just one of the things that this lens can do is to serve as a pretty decent portrait lens. And of course, at macro distances, this lens does perform well. We can see how far I can zoom into my chart here for to test for the 2:1. In fact, I had to take a couple of shots just to kind of give you a little perspective of what all is there, because the magnification level is so high. But we can see here that you can see easily all the fibers of the paper and the ink as it has sunk into them. Pretty impressive performance up close for such an inexpensive lens. The lens does have one other vulnerability that I want to highlight, and that is that it is somewhat flare prone. You can see here that there's both a loss of contrast wide open with the bright sun in the frame, and then also some pretty significant ghosting artifacts. Stopping on down, you can see the 12-pointed aperture blades. You can also see that we continue to have both a loss of contrast and also some ghosting artifacts. And then even with the sun not in the frame at all, just coming through a window, but I knew that this is going to be a flare prone lens when I was shooting this shot, and I saw these flare artifacts here in the corner of the frame, even though I wasn't even thinking really about the sun being a component here. So a byproduct is that you are going to have to be careful with the lens, particularly when you consider the fact that it does not come with a lens hood, nor will it be easy to add one.
So at the end of the day, this is a lens that obviously does a lot of things, and it does all of them reasonably well. This is certainly a jack of all trades lens, and while it's not some kind of master class type lens, I would say that it does most things moderately well. And for the price point of only around $400 US, this is a lot of lens, and you can use it for a variety of applications. I can see this being an intriguing lens for those that are interested in the idea of doing some tilting or shifting and don't want to spend a massive amount of money. Those who are interested in doing high degrees of magnification, but again, you don't want to spend a lot of money. And as we've seen, this is a lens that also doubles as a pretty decent 100mm portrait lens. And so I think there's a lot of stuff you can do with this lens. And for example, I'm reviewing this during the winter. This lens is a lot of fun during the winter months because it gives you a lot of creative options for the type of photos that you can produce while, maybe not being able to move around outside in the same way during the winter due to weather conditions. So for $400, a very intriguing lens, and I'm certainly very proud of TTArtisan for taking on the challenge of producing such a lens like this. It's one that I consider useful, and I look forward to playing with it a little bit further moving ahead. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. Also, some buying links there if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Beyond that, there is linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, or to get channel merchandise. And of course, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.